Okay, good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me online or in person, I'm Jarrod Grover. I'm the senior rabbi at Beth Tikvah, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our synagogue tonight. If you have not yet signed up for our synagogue email list, I invite you to do so. Make sure you're doing so through our website and stay updated about programs like these. It's a busy programming season for us, so I don't want anyone to miss anything. Like many of our classes, tonight's program is being recorded and will be available in case you know somebody who wasn't able to be here live. They can review the presentation from our website. Daniel, probably tomorrow morning it'll be posted. So tonight's program, Jews, the Jewish state, and our obligation to Ukrainian refugees, is sponsored by a fund that was set up at Beth Tikvah when my mother passed away several years ago, the Janice Grover Memorial Fund. So this gives me another opportunity to thank everyone who contributed to that fund, who made tonight's program possible. I also want to thank Daniel for being here tonight, and to him and to Gail for their help in organizing the logistics of the program. And please help yourself to the food that we ordered. Few issues have united the Western world more quickly than Russian leader Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine last month. In response to his brutal war, Canada and the United States and our allies have shuttled weapons and aid to Ukraine and slapped severe sanctions on Russia. These moves have received broad support internationally, but Israel has been a prominent outlier. For many reasons, Israel has chosen a cautious, balanced approach that has led to some awkward and challenging moments. Some of these controversies have involved Israel's obligations to Ukrainian refugees, which are now estimated, I just looked at this, they're now close to 4 million homeless Ukrainians who are scattered among many neighboring countries. Already, thousands, close to 20, have arrived in Israel, our tiny, already overcrowded Jewish homeland. And Israel is expecting the largest influx of immigrants since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some of these have Jewish roots, but most do not. How should Israel balance its historic desire to help people fleeing war with its responsibility as a haven for the Jewish people? To help us understand these questions and other related questions, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Rabbi Idan Rakovsky, our guest this evening. Rabbi Rakovsky was born in Israel, but grew up in Montreal. He's the son of a chazan, and because of that has experienced a variety of different synagogues and Jewish communities across North America in his life. It should be noted that for his military service, Idan served as a commander in the IDF Intelligence Unit 8200, or it's commonly known as Shmona Matayim. They don't let anybody into Shmona Matayim. And he served there with distinction for 4 years. Idan is a graduate of Yeshivat Givat Shmuel and Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa. Idan and his wife Priel live in Kibbutz Masuot Yitzchak, which is in the south. Currently, Idan is in Toronto serving as a Beit Midrash fellow or an Avrech in the Yeshiva University Zichron Dov Kollel. He's also the rabbinic assistant at Congregation Sharei Tefillah. I hope you will find Idan as engaging and thoughtful as I have found him to be. And we're looking forward, all of us, to learning from him this evening. The format will be basically a lecture. Idan is going to guide us through sources on these questions, and we'll try and leave some time at the end for questions from those who are here, and even some time for those who are joining us on Zoom. Those who are here with us in person have received handouts already, and I would invite those of us online to take a look at their chat box, their chat dialogue at the bottom of the screen, where you can print out, where you can download and print out the same booklets that we have here. All you have to do is click on that link and print them out, or if you want, you could just follow along with us. So I'm going to be quiet now and give the floor to Rabbi Rakovsky, who I welcome very warmly to Beth Tikvah.
Much, Rabbi. Thank you very, very much. Even before, thank you for the introduction, Rabbi Grover. Thank you, and hello, shalom, everyone in person, everyone on Zoom. Thank you very much for being here. Before I start, just something that I feel like I cannot start without addressing first. Those of you who follow Israeli news, there was another terror attack earlier today in Israel, in Bnei Brak and in Ramat Gan, third in a week. 5 innocent citizens were murdered. I live, before I lived in the kibbutz, I lived in a small city called Givat Shmuel. Givat Shmuel is 5 minutes from where this exactly happened. And that's a place where I used to go, I would say even sometimes once a week. 11 people that were killed were murdered only because they were Jews in 1 week. This is not why we established the state of Israel for. That's not what we did it for. And I feel like, just because we're not going to discuss this today, we're going to discuss other nations' problems, not our problem. In some cases, it's also our problem. But I do want that this class, this lecture, at least the more, I would say, religious part of it that we will get to would be for the Ilui Neshama and for the very quick recovery for all of those who were injured. And Bezrat Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and God will make Yashkin Shalom, and will brings more peace upon us. I think peace is something we need in Israel and in other places now in the world more than ever. Thank you very much. On a very sharp shift, I will thank you again, Rabbi Grover, for this introduction. I want to say it's a very I'm very humbled to be here. It's a very it's an amazing opportunity to speak in front of a congregation that I haven't had the opportunity to do that before. I want to apologize first that my English is not my first language. So if there is anything that I'm saying and maybe, I don't know, you don't understand or you want me to repeat it, please don't hesitate to tell me. Rabbi Grover here also will help me with that thing, even if it's something that English thing, or even if something regarding the content, I will try to do my best here. So this is an apology beforehand. I also want to say that I'm not sure we will be able to cover this entire very challenging subject, this very challenging topic in the scope that we have tonight. We will try to do the best. We'll try not to just touch the surface, but we want to engage with the challenges that this topic has to offer us as Jews, has to offer us as people that see Israel as our homeland, not only to Israelis. But I do apologize if there are some things that I didn't dive into as much as possible. If you do have questions, please leave them towards the end. If it's something again that I need to explain myself again, then of course you can jump ahead and ask me. So as Rabbi Grover said, this class, not a lecture. I don't want to say a lecture. I'm not a lecturer. This is a class we're going to learn together. It's called Jews, the Jewish State, and the Ukrainian Refugees. I kind of created this booklet just for us to to accompany us, to help us through this journey that we were going to go through tonight. I want to start our conversation by, first of all, explaining what exactly has happened in the last very busy month in Israel regarding right after, I would say, Putin started his invasion to eastern Ukraine that was on February 28th, all the way until today. We're now exactly 1 month after that started. And just try and give our Israeli perspective. What exactly was Israel's response to this kind of crisis? I want to start with this timeline that I created here on the first page. You can all see it. That's just a short timeline. Again, I apologize for the dates are not as in the Canadian format. So that's not June or September. Those are February and March. As you can see, just for us to understand that exactly a month ago, that looks like it's been way more than a month, right? But it was a month ago, on February 20th of February, where Putin announced that his invasion to eastern Ukraine. It didn't take long. Exactly 1 week later, Israel has already faced the first, I would say, wave of refugees that came. First of all, there were Jews that were evacuated by the Israeli government from Ukraine, from places like, for example, Kiev, Uman, where we know that in Uman there is a very big Hasidic community, places like Odessa and Kharkov, many other places in Europe. Jews were already being evacuated even before Putin's invasion to Ukraine. They've already arrived to Israel before, but the first wave of refugees, those who doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Israel, that doesn't necessarily have any connection, who are not Jewish, they started arriving 1 week after the invasion in March 6th. And then Ayelet Shaked, the Minister of Interior, as we say in Hebrew, Sarat Hapnim, we'll talk about her. She decided what's going to be Israel's policy regarding this crisis. What Israel's response going to be to any refugee that is knocking on the door of Israel and say, please let me in. I fled the war. I want to be here. Most of the refugees, we need to understand, were women and children. Most of the men and the males, you probably know, they could not leave Ukraine. They had to stay there. Again, as Rabbi Grover said, I was in the army for 4 years, and I wasn't a combat soldier. I knew how to shoot the gun when I had to, because every soldier needs to do so. But every time I had to do something with the gun, for myself, I'll tell you personally that it wasn't the best experience, because if you don't really feel, if any of you has ever had any experience in the army, if you don't really feel confident with holding a weapon in your hand and knowing that you will know how to use it when time calls, God forbid, you don't want to do it. And in Ukraine, most of the men that were recruited now to the army, they've never even held a gun in their lives. So just to try and imagine what they're going through. So Ayelet Shaked, her policy was not to open the gates to everyone who want to come in. It's not that our gates in Israel are open for many reasons, which we'll talk about it in a second. Why can't we be like Poland or any other country? And she decided, as you can see, that was on March 6th. So she decided to determine a quota. That was a quota of 2,000 refugees that could come to Israel. Of course, when we say refugees, it's important to say that they are not Jewish. Every Jew, doesn't matter where he lives, can come and make aliyah to Israel. The government cannot block any Jew to come to Israel unless he is a criminal, or he can, make some bad stuff going on in Israel, where then the Minister of Interior can decide and say we're banning him or blocking him from coming to Israel. Every Jew can come to Israel. So when we say refugees in this lecture, in general, we're not talking about the Jews of the Ukrainian Jews. We're talking about people that doesn't necessarily have Jewish roots. By the way, do you know who's entitled to come to Israel by Chok HaShvut, as we call it, the return law? Right. So the letter, I would say the word of the law, the letter of the law was changed several times during Israeli history. It started with, if you were born to a Jewish mother, then you're allowed to come. Once there was another generation, maybe if your mother's mother was Jewish, if your mother's father or something was Jewish also. Today, it's not only today, but it changed I think in the 70s. And I'm not sure if that was in the 70s. I think it was in the 70s, where they changed it. And they said that if he is a Jew that was born to a Jewish mother, and he is not at the same time a member of another religion. That was based on what we call in Israel, Ha'ach Daniel. There was a priest called Daniel and he came to Israel. That was a very long story, which I'm not going to get into now, but every Jew can come to Israel, also the Ukrainian refugees. And she decided, Ayelet Shaked, she's from the party of Yamina, which is now the Prime Minister's Naftali Bennett's party in Israel. She decided that the quota would be 2,000 refugees. Why 2,000? There is no really a reason why. That's just an estimation of how many people she thought would probably come to Israel. It's not like that every Ukrainian has something to do in Israel. I mean, in order to come to Israel from Ukraine, it's a very long journey when you need to come by flight. You cannot just take a train unless you want to go through Syria and etc., which they don't really think they want to do after they flee the war. And she also decided that every refugee, that enters Israel will need to deposit 10,000 shekels, which equivalent to around 3,000 Canadian dollars, something like that, per person. That means that if that's a family, if that's a woman, a mother with 3 children, it's already 40,000 shekels. Why? What is this deposit? That's for us an insurance that we know that the moment they can come back, they will say, okay, we're living in Israel. We're not going to stay here anymore as residents. We're not going to stay in Israel. We're going to go back to our homeland, to Ukraine, and then they will get the money back. This was the first Israeli policy regarding those refugees from Ukraine. And I have to tell you, even some of you that might sound I don't know, silly, or might sound really, why, how come she decided that? Back then, that was a week after the invasion started. Back then, we were not the only country who decided on such regulations, on such policy. There were other countries in the world as well who decided that as well. And back then, it sounded pretty fine to do that. We didn't know exactly what's going to be the crisis. We couldn't expect how big the volume of refugees was going to be in Israel. But then something happened. 3 days later, because of the way our, I would say, very challenging government is, our very challenging coalition. Those of you who are familiar a little bit with Israeli politics, you know that our prime minister is Naftali Bennett, who is very right-wing kind of a politician, and he formed the government with some left parties, as the Avodah, which is the Labor Party, with people from Meretz, or the very left parties, also with some Arabs from southern Israel. It's very complicated to get into that. Maybe in a different time we'll come, Rabbi, and we'll talk about the very interesting Israeli politics. But his very, I would say, fragile government, his very fragile coalition didn't make this very easy, didn't make him very easy lives. And Ayelet Shaked, who's, again, she is from Naftali Bennett's party, she's also very right-wing. She got very, I would say, harsh responses and harsh, I would say, opinions from her colleagues in her government. The main one is, I brought here the picture, that was on March 9th, Minister of Transportation, Merav Michaeli, that's her name. She opposes Shaked's policy. She said, no, 2,000 are nothing. We're a Jewish nation. And only then, by then, we already started hearing the claim that how come a nation that fled Europe as a nation of refugees that fled Europe because of the wars in World War II and the Holocaust, and they played the Holocaust card already very early in the game. We will see this Holocaust card in the as we continue this lecture. And then the quota, Shaked was, the media was very supportive. We have to say the media was very supportive of Merav Michaeli, and all the pressure, she couldn't stand the pressure. And eventually Ayelet Shaked increased the quota to 5,000 people, refugees, to come in. We need to understand that by those 3 days, 2,000 refugees has already come. All right, so this quota was already been full after 3 days. All right, by refugees. We didn't expect so many refugees to come to Israel. I'll explain later what happened. Why didn't we estimate that, and why many refugees came to Israel. Then something very challenging happened in Israel, and the Israeli leading television news channel called Arutz 12, channel 12. It used to be channel 2. If you know Keshet, if a little bit you're familiar with Israeli television, they showed in their news show, they showed pictures from within Ben Gurion Airport, where because the quota was already been full, people could, just refugees that came to Israel, managed to come all the way from Ukraine through either through Romania or Poland, fly to Israel. they got stuck in the airport because they were not allowed to enter Israel. And there were very difficult pictures. You can see it in the second page. On the bottom of the second page, you can see some pictures from Ben Gurion Airport, pictures that we've never thought we would see in Israel, right? In the modern state of Israel, of refugees sleeping on mattresses, on their clothes, on the floor of the airport. You can see their clothes and their socks and underwears on the chairs themselves of Ben Gurion, pictures we never thought we would see in our lifetime, and in Israel. And when that was released, when everyone in Israel saw those pictures, I would say a very big, a very strong movement of protests in Israel started to rise against Ayelet Shaked herself, because everyone thought she is the one who determined this quota, and she's the one whose face is on this policy, and she's responsible for that. And not only that, by March 12, you can see in the timeline back then, in the timeline, on March 12, the embassy of Ukraine and Israel sues Ayelet Shaked. They charge Ayelet Shaked in court, saying that how come you're not helping all the refugees coming to Israel? Who are you to say you're a refugee, you cannot come? Now, just as a short history background, Israel is part of what we call the, I wrote it in English, I know that in Hebrew. Yeah, it's the Geneva Convention. Thank you very much. You can see the picture here of the signing of the International Convention relating to the status of refugees in Geneva in 1951. Israel was already only 3 years old when Israel signed this convention. Now, we need to understand that Israel is part of it. Now, this convention doesn't say you must bring as many refugees as possible to your country and let them become citizens. That's not what the convention says. But the convention says if you have a refugee who's knocking on your door, you're not allowed to send him back to where he came from. And there were refugees in Ben Gurion Airport that the officers and the border officers told them, we're sorry, you need to take the flight back to where you come from. You need to go back to Ukraine. And this was something that Israel would not, it was something that was against this convention that Israel specifically has signed. It was even a little bit more complicated, because in 2014, Israel signed this agreement with Ukraine that we were going to be waived from both citizens, going to be waived from tourist visas. And if we're waived from tourist visas, how come you're not letting Ukrainian in? They're just like any other tourist that doesn't need a visa.
As well, because some people see the Geneva Convention as arising from
exactly.
So here's the Jewish state, and they're accusing the Jewish state of not abiding by a convention that was motivated by the history of its own people.
Exactly. In 1951, where there were masses of refugees all around Europe, they had to do something with them. So they had this convention. The pressure, again, was very beneficial. And then one day later, Shaked went to the airport. That was 3 days after the pictures from Ben Gurion Airport were shown to everyone. Shaked went to the airport. She had a press conference there, and she said, we're going to change totally the way we're going to treat refugees that come to Israel. First, any refugee that want to come to Israel will need to fill up some forms, beforehand, before he even boards the flight. Already when he's still in Europe, he needs to fill up the form. Then if he's approved, only then he can come on the plane. And I think the biggest change that she announced was that if you're a refugee and you have a relative in Israel, a relative can be your parents, your children, even your divorced husband, can be your cousin. You have someone that you know of that lives in Israel, and this someone can come and fill the form for you in Israel already, you'll be allowed to enter. In other words, the quota of 5,000, which was increased afterwards already, was only for Ukrainians that doesn't have anything to do with Israel. Not if they're Jews, and not if they have any relative in Israel. Now, why did I say that originally, that there were already 2,000 refugees that came in a week, in 3 days, to Israel? Because after the very big aliyah after the Soviet Union has fallen, there were many Jews from that area that came to made aliyah to Israel. I can tell you the personal note that my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law is married to someone, And she brought her grandmother from Kharkov because she made Aliyah with her parent. Her grandfathers and grandparents are still in Ukraine. We have thousands of families in Israel that have relatives, can be close relatives, can be far relatives, but they have relatives in Ukraine and in Russia as well. We're not talking here about Russia's Jews that are coming and making Aliyah today, but this is also an interesting thing to talk about. So there were many Ukrainians that came to Israel only for a limited time because they know their cousin, they know their daughter-in-law, they know someone. And they said, we need a shelter. We want to come to Israel for something. And Ayelet Shaked said, we're going to open our doors to everyone who want to come in. And he can prove he has someone in Israel that can be his, I would say, supervisor. It can be his, in Hebrew we say apotropos. I don't know how to say that in English in that sense. But it can be with him. Thank you, adoptive parent. Thank you very much. A week later, as we say in Megillat Esther, we just went through Purim, V'chamat hamelech shechacha, and the king fury was I think was released and was a little bit was better, and people a little bit forgot of what happened with Ayelet Shaked. That's how you go in Israel with the news. But a week later, there was a protest in Habima Square in Tel Aviv, and none other than Vladimir Zelensky himself has addressed all the Knesset members in Israel, and those people in the protest, they showed his lecture, his address to everyone, to the public in this protest in Habima Square. And I don't know if you followed his words to the Israeli Knesset, but he said something that turned everyone very, very furious against him. He said, how can he played the Holocaust card, and he said, how come a nation, a people that were fleeing the Holocaust, and they know what it means to be refugees and what it means that there is another nation that oppresses them, how can you stand by and be silent and see what Russia is doing to us? Because what they're doing to us is the same thing as Hitler has done to the Jews. Now, I want to say it clear as an Israeli who's standing here in front of you, this is a shame. This is not the Holocaust. This is not the Holocaust for many reasons. There was nothing like the Holocaust in the history of the world. There will never be something like the Holocaust in the history of the world. No one, doesn't matter how they suffer now because of a war with Russia, no one can play the Holocaust card to Israel government and try and think that will help Israeli government by assisting Ukraine with many things that they want. For example, bringing more refugees, or something that Vladimir Zelensky very much wants, and this is helping him with some army equipment that Israeli has. He wanted, for example, Iron Domes that are coming from American money anyway. This was another complicated issue, but he wanted help from the Israeli army. And we say constant no. And I will tell you why we say no. It's not easy to say no to a country that is fighting an oppressor that is coming. But again, I was a commander in 8200 for 4 years. I dealt with Russia on a daily basis. We need to understand, we are now in America. America today is not what it was 15 and 20 years ago. Russia is the one who's controlling the Middle East. It's controlling Syria, it's controlling the air in Jordan, it's controlling all the northern part of Israel. And we need the first priority for us as a state is, first of all, to protect our own people. And by that, we must remain as neutral as possible with Russia, so we can still have the freedom to act in Syria and in Iran and in other places that Russia has a very strong footprint. Because if we are going to wake up this sleeping bear, it's not going to be good for us. And I can tell you on a daily basis, I dealt with problems with Russia on a daily. I cannot explain more than that. Excuse me for that. But I can tell you, and you can choose to believe me or not, we need Russia's support in that case. It's not that we decided that we need to, it's not that we're on her side. It's not the thing. We need to protect our people in Israel. And therefore, if we need to choose whether to support Ukraine in this crisis or to continue protecting the Israeli citizens, we choose to protect the Israeli citizens with no doubt. And Zelensky knows that, because Naftali Bennett plays the moderator here because of our very good connection that we have with Russia. Anyway, that was in March 20. And the last thing that I brought it here in the timeline, that we marked the 15,000 refugees that entered Israel in March 22nd. We're almost in 20,000 refugees already by today. This is, I think, I try to check. I think this is more than Canada, by the way. All right, more than Canada, more than almost every other country that doesn't have a border with Ukraine. Just for us to understand that. After this very long introduction, I want to explain the difficulty in Israel, both sides of the equation. What exactly are the opinions in Israel regarding this very challenging crisis, very challenging situation? So first of all, something that everyone agrees on is just what I said. Don't play the Holocaust card. That's very demagogic. You're not gonna gain anything by saying, look what happens to us. This is exactly what happened to you, because it's not. And more than that, it decreased, I think, a little bit the support in the Israeli society towards Ukraine, towards Zelensky. It decreased that, and it didn't help for that. I brought two very important journalists in Israel, Amit Segal, as you see here, and Michal Peilan. Those are two very important journalists in Israel. They're both in the same they're in the same channels, in channel number 12. They're very much very well known in Israel, and they had a discussion which was not, it was offer. I don't think it was something that was on purpose, but she said something, he replied, he said something, she replied, and that was recorded on TV and everyone watched it. And I think I brought the thing that each side said. I think it demonstrates, I think the best demonstration that can be to the both sides of voices you can hear in Israel. And then I'll try to explain a little bit what they said. So Amit Segal, he's a very well-known journalist. He's from the right side of the map. And he said something, you can see, after the fury, everyone were furious about Ayelet Shaked and the quota that she decided on. And he said, if Ayelet Shaked, and again, excuse me for the translation, I tried to translate it as good as possible from Hebrew. If Ayelet Shaked succumbs to the pressure, and because of those photos from the airport, she approved entry for 50,000 refugees, because back then they said, no, we want 50,000, not 5,000. 50,000 refugees. So if she approves entry for 50,000 refugees, what will we say when the 50,001 refugee will come? What will the state of Israel do if he too is an elderly man who faints in the airport? Because there were pictures, videos of elderly men who's fainting in the airport because of the lines, because of the heat, because of everything. What will we do then, right? Therefore, it is important to understand that the question here is not how many refugees we should accept into the state of Israel, but whether we are willing to give up the value of the state of Israel as a Jewish state for a different value of rescuing war refugees in Ukraine. Why? Why did he say what he said? In his opinion, as we'll see in a minute, in surveys, recent surveys in Israel, many people support this opinion. We didn't establish the state of Israel for no reason. We all together, all Jews in the world, established the state of Israel, so we will have a homeland and a shelter. But we will have more than a shelter. We will have a country where we can call home, that it will be a Jewish country. It would not be a regular country like any other country in the world. The Jewish nation is a nation, and that's why it's a little bit of a pre-Pesach kind of a program. We need to address Pesach also. And we know that the Jewish, you know what the first sentence in the Israeli declaration, in the Declaration of the State of Israel is? When David Ben-Gurion stood in Friday of Hey B'Iyar on 4 p.m. in Tel Aviv, and he declared the State of Israel, he started reading from the scroll that was back then on pages. Afterwards, they copied it to a scroll, which is called the Declaration of the State of Israel, because Israel doesn't have a constitution, and this is kind of like a constitution for us that guides the values that, according to the government and the Knesset, needs to register their laws. And by this, in the light of this scroll, this declaration, court can decide what is right and what is wrong. That's like a constitution, but it's not. And the first sentence in this declaration is, I'll say in Hebrew, then I'll translate. Be'eretz Israel kam ha'am ha'yehudi. In the land of Israel, the Jewish nation was formed. But there is one problem, folks, with this sentence. The Israeli people were not formed in the land of Israel. Where were we formed? In Egypt, in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, in Exodus, when we went out of Egypt. We were not formed in the land of Israel. The land of Israel was not, I would say, was not a condition for the formation of the Israeli people. Unlike many other nations who were first coming together into a land, into somewhere they can call home, and then they started to develop some connection, some culture, something in the community, and then they called themselves a nation. The Israeli process was vice versa. We first were formed as a nation. We were shaped. We're crystallized as a nation, and only then we entered our land. That's a different way. For us, the land of Israel is not like any other country in the world. It doesn't matter if you live in Israel or if you're not living in Israel. It doesn't matter if you're Orthodox, conservative, or Reform. Israel is your homeland. When you come to Israel and you visit Israel, it's not like visiting any other country. Now, because I said that, I do want also on a personal note, which is not related to the topic, it's a little bit offside here, but if, and again, as a shaliach from Israel, if for some reason, and I know that happened, and not that I'm even representing someone in Israel, but I'll try my best, that if for some reason in the past years, because of political or other reasons, Jews outside of Israel had difficulty calling Israel their home, I want to apologize upon myself as an Israeli for that my country has caused that, because it wasn't supposed to happen. Israel is the home for everyone. Doesn't matter what exactly they're affiliated to. Doesn't matter how that. It could be because of COVID that people were not allowed to enter if they're Jews to Israel as tourists. It could be because of things in the Kotel, in the Western Wall. It could be because of many other reasons. Things that happened there shouldn't have happened. Every Jew in the world supposed to know and to feel that Israel is his homeland. Every Jew that lives anywhere on the globe. And that connects me back to the thing here that we say Israel is the Jewish state. And if we let, as kind as we can be, if we let unlimited number of people who can be very weak and can be refugees of war, but if we will let them enter the already packed, as Rabbi Grover said at the beginning of when he introduced me, if we will let in anyone who want to come, if we will let him in, we will lose the Jewish aspect of the state of Israel. Because what makes Israel a Jewish state? The fact that the majority of citizens are Jewish. The moment they're going to be not a majority, they're going to be, I would say, a major minority or a great minority within Israel that are not affiliated with Jewish values, with Jewish culture, with the Jewish religion, we will lose Israel as a Jewish state. It would become a state like any other thing with maybe a color of Judaism in its shades, but it would not be a Jewish state. And this is something that we as Jews in Israel, and specifically in Israel, we very much feel almost in a daily basis, not only now with Ukraine, it happened already before, also with the Palestinians crisis, also with other crises that happened. We need to try and maintain as much as possible our state as a Jewish state. On the other side of the barricade, we have Michal Peilan. And when Michal Peilan heard this words of Amit Segal, she couldn't stand herself and she had to respond. And she said, after what he said, she said, my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor, rescued by a righteous among the nations, by Chassid Umot HaOlam. I have been receiving a lot of criticism in recent days for the compassion we show towards non-Jewish refugees. My grandfather fought in the War of Independence so that there would be a Jewish state here and would show compassion for non-Jews as well. And I am ashamed that this is how we treat our refugees. Michal Peilan is not saying something very different than Amit Segal. I think that Michal Peilan also wants Israel to be a Jewish state. But she says, if we want to be a Jewish state, one of our Jewish values is, as we know from Pesach, you need to take care of those who are more vulnerable, to live with you. And if there are refugees who are knocking on our doors and they say, please let us in, we fled from the war zone. How can you, as a Jew, stand and tell them, I'm sorry, I'm locking the doors, you're not allowed to come in? Now, I'm not choosing a side here. Maybe at the end I will say my personal opinion. I just want to try and convey the difficulty, the challenge within Israeli society today, that everyone agrees that Israel is supposed to be a Jewish state. Most of the Jews that live in Israel believe that Israel should maintain and be a Jewish state. The question is, what does it mean to be a Jewish state? How can you remain Jewish, a Jewish state, says Michal Peilan, if you're not letting refugees in? Amit Segal say, I know, but what happens when I'm going to let everyone come in? Where are you going to put the red line? Where are you going to draw the line? How then we're going to be, it's very complicated. Then I think the first conclusion from this lecture would be, if you were on one of those sides, try and understand the other side as well here in that case, because it's not black and white. It's not black and white. It's very challenging. If you think that Israel should open the doors for everyone to come in, then I'm coming here and I'm telling you that's a problem. Opening the doors for everyone is not the right thing to do. And if you said, no, Israel should close the doors, maybe let only a few people come in and should remain and maintain their Jewish character of a state. And I'm telling you, but then you lose something as a Jew if you're not letting people in who are coming and fleeing from a crisis. Just putting that on the table. I brought here some data just to prove what I said in Israel, just for you to show, to see what exactly is the current situation in Israel. This was a survey from the beginning of the war. That was March 8th. I can tell you, I didn't see any other survey since then, but my feeling is they follow closely Israeli media and they follow closely Israeli social media. And I know from my family in Israel, I think the numbers would continue in that same, I would say, vector. All right. So if something is already, the gap would only I would say, be bigger today. So just let's go through the question. Do you think Israel should or should not accept non-Jewish refugees from Ukraine? 41%, folks, 41% of Jews in Israel at the beginning of the war said, no, close the doors. Close the doors now. And if you're going to open the door for one refugee, you cannot close the door for the other. You are closing hermetic all the doors of Israel. You're not letting them in, or you're going to open for everyone. 41% said Israel should not, almost half, Israel should not open the doors for refugees. 38% Israel should. It's almost equals. 21% back then of Jews said in Israeli said, no, we don't know actually if we should or not. 2, what should be Israel's policy regarding non-Jewish Ukrainian refugees? That's a little bit different question. Kind of the same question, but a little different. Here, the company that asked, they added another option, which is to determine a quota. And then what happened? Many people started to say, oh, wait, so those who say don't let anyone in say, no, we cannot not let anyone in. We need to help to some people. It can't be infinite. We must determine a quota, a number of people that can come in. It cannot be that we will let everyone in. That's why 32%. But in general, everyone who said should, most of them continued and said, let everyone in. It doesn't matter. Those who are, I would assume the 31% would be people like Michal Peilan, which we just saw. The 42 and the 16% are people more like Amit Segal, as we saw. Just 2 more questions that are not exactly related to the refugees, but just for you to see how it goes on in Israel. 3, do you think Israel should or should not supply military equipment to Ukraine? It is very, I would say, accepted in Israel. 64% said Israel should not, by all means, help Ukraine in military equipment. We don't want Israeli weapons to shoot Russian soldiers. That's the last thing we want to happen for us as a state. 18% of people said yes, but it's the same amount of people said they don't know. And 4, do you think Israel Prime Minister Naftali Bennett should or should not take on the role of a mediator in the war between Russia and Ukraine? I was very surprised to see that one. 44%, it's almost equal, but 44% of the Jews said, the Israelis said, no, he doesn't supposed to do that. I don't exactly understand why. I have to tell you, I'm still thinking why they wouldn't want him to become a moderator. When they first suggested that bringing both Zelensky and Putin to Jerusalem, that making Jerusalem the city of the peace, I would say, talks, that was an amazing thing that could happen. This is what Yerushalayim is meant to be. This is the era of Shalom. This is the era of peace. This is Shalu Shalom Yerushalayim. This is where every nation should see and look into and say, oh, peace comes from here. I don't understand why many Israelis said maybe he should not. I think it's more than, I think that how they really feel towards the prime ministers themselves and other reasons. And I think it's reflected in this question as well. And I brought here the number of a lot of
Israelis that I speak to fall in that category say we have enough problems here to manage, like how you opened up today. Yeah, we don't need to take on other problems that are which makes involved in World War III. Which makes very much sense. Right. Which actually makes very much sense. Very caught in this.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I brought here just for you to see the numbers. They're not very updated. I think they're for last week. But as you can see, the total number of refugees that entered Israel are 15,000. 1,000 of them were refused for some reasons. All right, maybe because they're criminals, maybe because they're not really Ukrainian, maybe because they had problem with their visa, they had problem with their passport. Many reasons can be for why someone would be refused. 4,000 of them are new olim from Ukraine, but look at the majority. 10,000 of them are those who are with a temporary visa who say we're coming to Israel in order to come back afterwards to Ukraine, to return to Ukraine. Only time will tell what exactly would happen with that, and if the Israeli government would actually manage to succeed in that. I want, in the 15 minutes that are left, I want to try and examine this kind of this very challenged crisis, this very challenged situation in the eyes of the Torah. Again, I'm a rabbinic assistant, so I cannot just give it's a very interesting lecture only about Israel. I want also to ask what the Torah has to say. Now, the Torah has to say anything about everything about anything. Also about this. What does the Torah has to say about a crisis of refugees? What should be our moral religion obligation towards this? Should we say, oh, let's open our doors to everyone to come in? Or maybe there are other ideas or other values within the Torah that say, wait a minute, hold your horses, don't let anyone in. So I opened with two sources that I think are very important for our discussion, because we're really dealing here with very challenging issues regarding morality and faith. What happens when your morality as a civil person, as a Western person, as someone who's a liberal person, what happens when that collides with your faith, with your Torah, with your halacha? What happens when what you think is right is not what your Torah thinks is right? It happens in every time, everywhere, in many issues, also here. So I just brought two ideas that I think can reflect what we're supposed to do here. One by Rabbi Avraham Cohen Cook, and the other one by Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. The first one, Rabbi Cook said in his book, Orot Tshuva, in source number 1, he said, the fear of heaven must not suppress one's natural morality, for then this fear is not pure. Rav Cook, if you know him, he lived around 100 years ago. All right, around 100 years ago, and he established what is called today the religious Zionism in Israel. He's the father of the religious Zionism in Israel, those who wear, as we say in Hebrew, kippah sruga. I am one of them, all right? And he wrote down in Orot HaKodesh, and he shaped the philosophy, the ideas of the religious Zionism in Israel. And he said, no, there are sometimes where you see that your natural morality, as he calls it, just for you, the common sense human being, where you say, this is something that can just not happen. But on the other side, you see your Torah saying, no, that's fine. It can happen. And you can all think about examples where you can feel it in your own Jewish life. And he said, the fear of heaven, this Yirat Shamayim, you being a religious person, you, the one who believed in God, this must not suppress one's natural morality, for then this fear is not pure. Don't suppress it. Don't say, oh, if I think this is wrong, but the Torah thinks it's right, probably I'm wrong. No. If you have a moral sense, as Rav Cook, and you think something is wrong, even though the Torah says, keep it. That means something about you, the human being. God also created this moral sense in you. He coined that within you, and that means something. Look in source number 2. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein was a Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion, Israel. He passed away 6 years ago. He wrote down in his article called Morality and Halacha in source number 2. Traditional halachic, it's an Orthodox rabbi. Traditional halachic Judaism requires from the Jew both loyalty to halacha and adherence to a moral emotion, which, being different from halacha, is nevertheless one piece with it. And it's completely obligatory by itself. There is sometimes a collision between the morality that you feel in halacha, try to settle them down. Don't just choose one over the other. You need to figure out what's going to happen here. And I think when we put those two sources in our minds, I think we can dive into this very difficult, challenging situation. So first of all, I want to talk about the limited halacha that Torah is giving us in order when we want to accept other people from other nations. We have a commandment from Exodus 23, verse 33, contains source number 3. The Torah says, they, the Gentiles, shall not remain in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me, for you will serve their gods, and it will prove a snare to you. The Torah says explicitly, your land in Israel should be in kind of a way clean from people who can harm you spiritually. In other words, from Gentile, from Goyim. Very difficult in our moral sense. Sometimes you could say, no, how come? The Torah says, right? I'm sending us back to the source number 1 and source number 2. It continues in Deuteronomy 7, Source number 4, where your God brings you to the land that you are about to enter and possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, and your God delivers them to you, and you defeat them. You must doom them to destruction, grant them no terms, and do not techonem. Now, what is the word techonem that the Torah uses? That's a word, very difficult word in Hebrew. That's not a word we use in modern Hebrew, not so even in ancient Hebrew. So the commentators try to explain, what do they mean not techonem those nations that live in this country want to come to your land? And as we can see, the Gemara, the Talmud, in source number 5, in tractate Avodah Zarah, in the volume of Avodah Zarah of idolatry, the Gemara explains, what do they mean? Do not techonem. What does the word techonem means? The Gemara says in source number 5, do not grant them a settlement in the land. We are forbidden. We're commanded not to let Gentiles have to settle in the land of Israel. We have a commandment which from the Torah.
It means to park.
Lachnot, not techonem. You're not using techonem in any way. It's the same short.
So
That's how here you see the Hebrew. Lo titenem chanaya. That's what they thought. Yeah, chanaya is the parking. So don't let them park. Don't let them get to encamp in Israel, in the land of Israel. Exactly. So we know, first of all, the Torah draws a line. She said, okay, you live in Israel. You live in the land of Israel. Not everyone are welcome. Not everyone. We didn't talk about what happened there from war. What happens if you're fleeing the war? But we know the Torah said, first of all, on the first surface, she said, not everyone can come in and live there if you are ruling that land, which is what's happening now in our situation. So now we get into halakhic discussion. What should we do? What should we do when they're goyim, or they're Gentiles, or people who are not Jewish, and they're fleeing from the war zone, and they're knocking on the door and say, let us in? Should we say, no, excuse us, the Torah said, lo techonen, the Torah said you should not give them a land, you should not bring them over to live in your land. We're sorry, go find somewhere else. You want to live it. We have many very kind neighbors surrounding Israel. Just choose which country you want to go to. Or do we say, wait, I understand that the Torah said that, maybe we can offer a solution, an halachic solution to this kind of plonter. And I want to offer an optional solution that's just coming from me. It's not an halachic advisory. It's not an halachic authority. It's not anything. Just by a little bit of what we call in the yeshivish world, a limud, when just to go through the sources a little bit and try to extract from them some instructions and laws, maybe we can try and seem a solution, an optional solution for the crisis, what the Torah would say about this crisis of refugees. I want to start with one of the very well-known rabbinic statements in the Talmud. It's written in the Talmud in tractate of Gittin, the volume of Gittin, where we talk about divorce, and not only, it's in source number 6. Our rabbis taught, we provide for the Gentiles poor with Israel's poor. We visit Gentiles sick with Israel's sick. And we bury the Gentiles dead with Israel's dead due to the ways of peace. The rabbi said in the Gemara, this is already from the time of the Mishnah. This is what I call an external source to the Mishnah, a braita, as we say in Aramaic. This is an external source of the Mishnah dated back to the time of the Second Temple, the end of the Second Temple. And they already said, there are some things you are allowed to do with someone who's not Jewish. Why? Not because you're afraid of it, maybe. Some commentators explain it that way. But the rabbis used the word shalom, due to the ways of peace. Now, what exactly are the ways of peace? Many commentators try to explain what exactly does it mean. Some say, if you're not going to do that, they will be very angry at you. They will fight you. So this is the peace. You're going to prevent a war or their kind of pogroms or any other thing that can happen by you being kind to them. Some say no. Maybe that's because if you're not going to be kind to them, if you're not going to do those very human gestures with them, maybe another country or the Tsar or someone else who is in charge of the land you live in, he will try to oppress you, or he will harm you. But others say just as simple as it is, you're a human being. That's just peace. Just be kind. That's just a human gesture. That's something that's supposed to be taken for granted. Some say also that. I want to start with it. We have within our Torah, we have a system that is called ger toshav. Ger toshav is translated into a resident alien. We have in our halachic system different ways on looking on a goy, on a non-Jew that is coming to Israel, and we have 3 ways of accepting him. The first way, which is the most common one, is to go through a conversion. regular conversion, what we call ger tzedek, which is a regular conversion. He accepting Yirat Shamayim, and the fact that there is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is the God of the world, and he accepts Torah and mitzvot, and he goes to the mikveh. All the rules. Rabbi Grover is way more expert in that than I am. So if you have more questions, you can address Rabbi Grover about that. But we have also two other systems that we can accept those non-Jews into us. The first one is called Ben Noach. Ben Noach means the son of Noach. That means a Gentile, a goy, a non-Jew that is accepting what is called the 7 mitzvot of the sons of Noah, the 7 commandments that there are for people who are not Jew. Also, the non-Jews, God has commanded some things to do. For example, they should not kill. They should not. They cannot steal. There's many things that they should not do. If he's keeping them, he has a slight different, I would say, status than a regular non-Jew who's just coming to Israel. But the closest, I would say, status to a Jew who is non-Jew, and he's not a conversion, so he's not a converted, so he's not a Jew, is what we call a resident alien, which is a ger toshav. What is a resident alien? Look at the Maimonides and the Rambam, the great Maimonides. In source number 7, he wrote down what is meant by a resident alien. What is the definition? A Gentile who makes a commitment not to worship false deities and to observe the other universal laws commanded to Noah's descendants. He does not circumcise himself or immerse. We accept this commitment, and he is considered one of the pious Gentiles. Why is he called a resident? Because we are permitted to allow him to dwell among us in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. So halachically, we have a system that permits a non-Jew to live in Israel despite the instruction of Lo Techonen that we just saw, despite this thing that the commandment that we're not allowed in Israel, in the land of Israel, to sell the land or to bring a non-Jew to live in it. We have a system that permits it. This is when this non-Jew is becoming an alien resident. And how exactly is he becoming an alien resident? The commentators try to explain how it is. Most of them agree, in a sense, that he needs, first of all, not to harm Jews. He cannot fight the Jewish people as a Gentile. All right, he cannot say, "Oh, I believe in Jesus, and we need to kill all Jews," or if he's a Muslim, say, "No, the Jews are wrong." He doesn't need to believe in Torah. He doesn't need to believe in all the Jewish values. He needs to accept the 7 commandments that we just talked about of the sons of Noah, which are very universal. Don't kill, don't steal, and all other kind of commandments. And then we allow him, if he acknowledges those 2 things in front of a court, of a Beit Din, he needs to come to a court and he needs to admit it and to sign all the things he needs to sign. We allow him to come and live in Israel as a non-Jew. That's the permission we have. There is one problem, folks. It sounds beautiful, right? But there is one problem. Most of the commentators, based already on the Gemara, on the Talmudic time, say it's all nice, but there's one problem. This system is not valid in our generations anymore. This system is valid only, as you can see now in source number 8. The Maimonides continues after he explained what is this resident alien. In source number 8, he continues and he says, we accept resident aliens only during the era when the Jubilee, as we see in Hebrew, is a Yovel. What is it? I wrote down the 50th year of the Shemitah cycle. We're now in a Shemitah year. Shemitah means that we're not allowed to work our fields, our gardens, our orchards in Israel because we need to let it rest. It's like a Shabbos for the land. So the 50th year, after 7 cycles of Shemitah, after 49 years, we get to the 51, then during which all property is returned to their original owners and all slaves are freed. Only when we celebrate this, we mention this Yovel, this Jubilee. Today we don't do it anymore because there's many reasons why you don't do it. From the Torah, you need all the people of Israel in the entire world to live in Israel in order to do that. That's a problem. The majority, some say it's a problem today, but we don't mention it. Only when this Jubilee era is observed. In the present era, says the Maimonides, and we're talking about now about 900 years ago, present era, yeah? Even if a Gentile makes a commitment to observe the entire Torah, with the exception of one minor point, he is not accepted. That's a problem. We just found a solution. We just found a system that can tell us, oh, beautiful, we can let everyone who want to come in. Only if they say we're not going to harm Jews, and if they're going to say we accept the 7 universal commandments of the sons of Noah. But we know that's a problem because we're not having this Jubilee. And here I come just again, Not that I'm deciding anything. No, I'm not a halachic authority or something else. Just try to offer for the discussion. And just if someone wants to hear us in the recording and he wants to do with it something, ma tov u'ma na'im. We are in a different situation today. Today, we have our own country. Today, the Jews are not as any other nation around the world. We have our own homeland. We can guard ourselves. We can try to live together as Jews in one place, even though maybe not most of the Jews are now in Israel. We don't exactly know the numbers. Maybe not all most of the Jews are now in Israel. We know that probably not most of the Jews are in Israel, but yet the state of Israel is the center of Jewish life in the world. What used to be America and before that Europe is now in Israel. Maybe by understanding the fact that now we don't celebrate the Yovel anymore. We don't celebrate the Jubilee. But we have something else, which what maybe in a sense is even greater. We have a country. We can choose for ourselves who we want to let in, who not. Maybe we can try and offer this resident alien kind of a halachic solution. First hand, not to give up on the commandment, on the problem that we have, that the Torah explicitly is saying you should not give up on the land of Israel to non-Jews. But on the other hand, we have the system that might help us get out of this plunder, of this problem, and actually try and use it for this kind of sake. We know that already there were a member of Knesset who said we should use this resident alien for Palestinians in Israel who want to stay in after a peace agreement. If they want to still live in Israel, we can try and apply this rule to them also. Why not thinking about applying this rule for refugees from Ukraine as well? If they want to come and they want to stay in Israel, they can be resident aliens. They can experience a little bit of the Jewish taste of what it means to be in a Jewish state, what it means to have Jewish culture, what it means that there is a homeland of Jews that fled war just like they are fleeing now, but they actually overcame it and they built something which is amazing, which is outstanding, nothing like that in the entire world. Maybe we can gain something also as a nation. And I want to finish before we move to the questions by a beautiful passage by Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch is a book with all the 613 mitzvot that are in the Torah, and the mitzvah 600 mitzvah. When he explains what is 600 mitzvah, he writes down in source number 9. We don't know exactly who wrote the book, by the way. It's anonymous. In source number 9, we say, God may he be blessed, created his world and wants its settlement. And the settlement of the world is established by the delivery of the weak from the hand of the one stronger than he. And also, because the eyes and heart of the pursued are always to God to deliver him from the hand of his pursuer. And it is like the matter that is written in Kohelet, and God seeks the pursued, meaning to say that he pursued seeks God and pleads with him. Therefore, blessed be he, commanded us to help him. And maybe by this, we all should understand, and maybe that's a bracha for us. First of all, that the limud would be again for the Ilui Neshama of those who were murdered in those terror attacks and for more peace in the world. And maybe we should all understand, whether we live in Israel, whether we don't live in Israel, whether we think Israel should open the doors for everyone to come in, doesn't matter who and when and how much, and whether we think now there is a value in the Jewish state and we cannot open our doors for everyone, we should all agree on one thing. There is someone who needs help. Smile to him. Just show your human face and say, we understand your problem, we'll help you solving it. If you're not going to live here, we'll help you finding a different place. But we're here for you. That is something that we're all obligated to do in Israel. Doesn't matter if we're going to let him in, if you're not going to let him in, because we are commanded, because we are a Jewish state, and this is a Jewish value. And if we want to maintain Israel as a Jewish state, we cannot give up on this kind of values. And as we go towards Pesach, I think there's many insight and some food of thought for us for Leil Seder. When we celebrate our freedom, try and think how now then we are free, how can we help other people to become free as well. Thank you very, very much. Toda rabba.
The summary is whether you believe in not letting in refugees or letting in many or just letting in a certain number, you're saying the Jewish value of being particularly compassionate towards the refugee is not something that halacha would allow us to sacrifice.
Of course.
That has to be
for 100%.
Right? If we can't settle, we have to do everything possible to make sure that there's a place
for 100%.
Are there questions from from those who are here, and maybe Daniel, you'll take the role of taking questions from people who are on the Zoom. So those who have some questions on the Zoom, just type it in the chat box, and Daniel will be your mouth. Fran.
Frida,
yes.
hello. Nice to meet you.
I'm looking at the chart at the bottom of the page, where it says temporary visa, New Orleans.
Mhm,
The New Orleans, those are Jews, I'm assuming.
exactly.
The
No,
temporary-
wait. No, they're not.
The New Orleans?
Be careful.
I-
Olim qualify for Jewish citizenship. They have one Jewish grandparent.
Yes.
It does not necessarily mean that
Thank
they
you.
are Jewish
Right.
by
I
halacha,
understand.
which is a whole other
Discussion.
I understand.
discussion.
There are some conversions that are not permitted in Israel.
The temporary visa, what is a temporary visa?
The-
Is that what you were talking about with the word you used? An alien, resident alien? Or does it give them a few years to stay there and will help them go wherever they want?
Frida, that is the name?
Frida.
Frida. So Frida is asking, just going to repeat. Thank you for the question, Frida. Just going to repeat it for the people, those on Zoom. She asked, what exactly are the temporary visa, 10,000 people that I wrote down in this table at the end of the charts. So again, just to make it clear, an alien resident, a resident alien, that's not something that we have now in Israel. That's not something that the system that is operating today. It's something that I suggest as maybe seeing those refugees and trying to apply this halachic system on them, and then maybe letting them come into Israel, and by that still trying and maintaining the Jewish identity of the state of Israel. That's first. Temporary visa means they're just like tourists, but they're refugees. They can come in for several times for an extended time. I think it's 3 months. If after 3 months they still cannot go back to where they came from, we're extending it for another 3 months or whatever that is until they can go back to where it is, and their visa is expired.
They have the right to settle in Israel on a temporary basis, but they don't have the right to settle permanently. There's a process,
right?
And that'll be I'm guessing there'll be a whole other fight about whether, it all depends on what happens, right? If they can never go back to Ukraine, well, where do they go, right?
That's
How long does a temporary visa last?
Right.
So
In other countries.
There's other countries in the
It's
world.
not so clear that there's always another country, There are refugees from Syria that still live in camps.
That's right.
And it's years after,
I know.
right?
That's right.
Do they still have to pay the $3,000?
No, so first of all, it's very nice to see you in person, but thank you for coming in person. It's wonderful to see you. If they need to pay the 10,000 shekels, no, not anymore. Nothing. No.
There is something I want to bring up. A friend of mine, who's a friend of mine, said, this sounds awful. I'm not donating to the across the bar, the Ukrainians. I will only donate to Jewish Ukrainians because of the history of Ukraine. And that terrible history. I'm not good on the history, but you know the name of the village or the city, and I have never forgiven them. And this is why should I? So this is something. Has this been spoken about in Israel?
Yes, thank you for reading that. I wanted to talk about it, but again, not in the scope of the time. When Zelensky used and he played the Holocaust card, though it made me and any other so furious because we cannot forget the past. We cannot forget the past. Now, even if you're not talking about the Holocaust, there are some righteous among the nations that came from Ukrainians, they saved Jews. But the Ukrainian, and we know it by fact, the Ukrainian helped the Nazis back then in turning Jews in. Not only that, Ukraine post-World War II is one of the countries that didn't even charge one Nazi post-World War II being accused of what he has done. They never found one Nazi that lived in Ukraine guilty after what happened. We cannot forget this. Even if we go backwards, already backwards to the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, we had pogroms in Ukraine by the Cossacks. We had problems back then already, and Jews were slaughtered and killed in Ukraine. The history between the Jews and Ukraine is not as beautiful as it might seem for the entire throughout the generation. So for sure, the moment Zelensky played the Holocaust card and said, you know what you suffered, look what we're going through, people really, even the people who really support Ukraine said this is way one step too much to take in that sense. And there's much more things to say about this. Unfortunately, not in that scope. Yeah, let's go here and then we'll go backwards. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. What's your name?
Jack.
Jack. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for this very instructive lecture.
Thank you very much.
My question is twofold. One, for the Ukrainians to come to Israel, they must have felt some connection to the state. So they could have gone to Poland, they could have gone anywhere in Europe and tried to resettle. And it seems as if the laws of return to the rest of Europe were much more lax than Israel. So my question is, did anybody survey these people as to why they came to Israel, made a decision? And the second question is, how difficult is it to convert once you're living in Israel?
Okay,
There's
wow.
potential for these 10,000 people to convert, which could be a bonus to the country.
Wow. Okay. I'll just repeat that question, Jack. That's fine. So first question that Jack is asking is what exactly, if we surveyed, if we asked the people and that came, the refugees that came to Israel, why did they choose Israel among any other country? The second question was, how difficult is the process of conversion in Israel? So for the first question, have a short answer. For the second question, have a long answer. I'll try to shorten it as much as possible. They didn't really survey them. There's no official survey there, but we know by changing, Ayel Chaked declared that, that's what she knows, but from the data that she has as a Minister of Interior, that most of them came because they have relatives in Israel. Most of them came because they have a cousin, they have a grandfather, they have a grandchildren, whatever they have in Israel. And that's why she said there's no quota if you have someone you can prove that knows you in Israel. All right, that's a relative. Now there is a discussion about friends. If you have a friend, colleague in Israel, and that's a little bit kind of maybe another answer for your first question. Israel is a very well advanced country regarding high tech and technology and industry of that. One of that's the Silicon Valley of the second Silicon Valley of the world. Again, someone who is an alumni of technological unit. And we work in, not me in the army, but many of the industry, the high tech industry in Israel is working or hiring employees in Ukraine that are making some of the job, some of the work in Ukraine. They're not living in Israel. They're working in Ukraine. They're working for Israeli companies. There are many thousands of Ukrainian programmers and computer scientists and that are working for Israeli companies. Almost every company today has at least a base in Ukraine. And now we had a problem that many colleagues in Israel wanted to bring their Ukrainian colleagues to Israel. Now that we need to help them, they're working for us. We want to bring them to Israel also to work for us, but also for that. And they're not counted as relatives. That's another problem now that we need to deal with. So maybe they're coming to Israel also because they want to work in this. And this is a very good opportunity in Israel. For your second question, it depends. It's very complicated. Depends how old you are. If you're in the army, there is a shorter way of doing that, a more pleasant way through the army, what is called native. Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. The second question was, how difficult is the process of conversion in Israel today? So it depends how old you are. Depends also if you're a child or you're in a grown up. Depends if you want to go through an official conversion by the chief rabbinate, which is I would say acknowledged by and accepted by the government, by the law, or do you want to do it privately, which can be done by a conservative conversion or by a reform conversion, also by an Orthodox conversion, which is not through the chief rabbinate. That's also a possibility that we have. And then you have problems regarding getting married in Israel or not. There's different options. The main option is by the chief rabbinate. And this is a thing for, I think, a way bigger discussion that we can talk about what exactly are the problems, the pros, the cons in conversion by the chief rabbinate in Israel. I think that most of the people in the room are had more expertise on that thing than I have in that sense.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. Thank you. That's a shorter answer. It's not easy at all. Yeah. Yes. Your name?
Rochelle.
Rochelle. Nice to meet you.
I just wanted to go back to the graphs. I was wondering again about the difference between a refugee who is from Ukraine and a refugee not from Ukraine, and whether Israel's concern about keeping neutrality with Russia plays into why there is specifically in the graphs. Did that make a difference as to why people don't want Ukrainian refugees?
Can you try and explain that again? I don't think I understand the entire. Okay.
Are people's views about wanting Ukrainian refugees influenced by wanting to keep
Mm.
position with Russia.
I'm not sure that Russia would be very angry if we let Ukrainian refugees enter. I don't think that's going to be the thing that will break the camel's back. I do think that people say if Israel can stay as neutral as possible, that by all means in any field you can think of. Maybe that's one of the reasons that they say maybe we should not allow. But the main reason why to not allow refugees from Ukraine coming in is to maintain the Jewish identity of the state of Israel.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's go here and then we'll jump to the other side. Yeah, your name?
David.
David. Nice to meet you.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand this notion of natural morality because I don't know what that is. But I do know the Torah, and the Torah looks like it's pretty clear. Like when you took us through the sources, I don't think there's any, you said it's not black and white, but the Torah seems to come down black and white. And then we have this notion of the Ger Toshav or the B'nai Noach, but we're again told based on traditional Jewish sources that they're not operative these days. So what we have is the first two sources that rely on natural morality, which is subjective and very hard to wrap your head around. And so when I look at the first one, we're talking about Yirat Shamayim. So all of a sudden we have a limitation. You must be Yirat Shamayim to enter into this as a starting point. And in the second one, which builds on the first position, that talks about halacha and moral emotion, it says they're different, but nonetheless they're at one with one another. In other words, they're not in conflict. So what's happening in your heart and what's happening with the halacha are not in contradiction. And although I don't understand what natural morality is, I do understand laws of nature or science, which is clearer. And I don't know who said it, but somebody said it, that anyone who cannot reconcile the Torah with science doesn't know enough about both.
It's the Rabbi Sachs.
No? He might have said it, but he was quoting someone.
He was quoting someone.
Yeah,
That's
I'm taking the same idea here that anyone who can't reconcile the Torah with the emotions or natural morality probably doesn't know enough about both because they're not at conflict with one another. And so I guess I'm bringing.
No, thank you. First of all, Rabbi, that's didn't prepare me for so amazing question, but thank you for that. That's an amazing congregation. Okay, I will try to summarize the question in a sense. I will try to those on Zoom. So David is asking, first of all, what is a natural morality? What does it mean to have a natural morality in a world where moral is a subjective concept? First. Second question that derives from that question would be, how can we actually determine what natural morality is? We know what science is, right? If I understand correctly, we know what science is, I say in an objective way, but we don't know what exactly the moral would be. But the Torah is very clear on what you should or should not do. I didn't exactly understand if you on what side you understood the Torah is here. But I will try to address at least the first part of the question, if that's fine. And regarding the natural morality, and again, this is way over the scope of this. I gave just finished last week. I have a mini series, 6-part mini series, Introduction to Jewish Philosophy, which I give in Sharit Fila and also on Zoom. Maybe if it's something that is interesting, we can try to arrange it here also, Rabbi Grover. The last 2 classes, where first class was I called it Jewish thought before the Holocaust, and the last class was Jewish thought after the Holocaust, trying to understand what the Holocaust and World War II has changed in Jewish thought in general. What we call not only Jewish thought, and that's going to be very on one leg, very, very shortly and briefly, what we call after the Holocaust, after World War II, in general, in the philosophy studies, is what is called the period, the era of postmodernism. And the era of postmodernism means, firsthand, we are modern people, but we're not modern. We're postmodern. Postmodern means said that there is no objective truth in the world. There is no one truth that I can say this is good and objective good, this is an objective bad. And I asked my people, the crowd in my class, I asked them what happens. Let's say hypothetically, if you find yourself in Africa, when you see there is a tribe that was never exposed to any civilization, and you see them taking a woman and she wants to be burned for their own gods. Would you, let's give hypothetically, you can stop it. Would you intervene and stop it by saying, what are they doing? They're going to kill this woman. Or would you say, no, I'm not? That was a very in dispute question, because many people said, wait, if I think it's good, they don't think it's good. I mean, if I think it's bad, they don't think it's bad. I have my own values because I was born in Canada and I grew up in this culture, in this society. I grew up that this is bad. She grew up that this is good. Who am I? And I said, this white privileged Western person to come and force my ideas and my values on this tribe that has their own, for thousands of years, their own values. Those kind of questions. And again, if I will ask my grandmother in Israel this question, she will not have any doubt. And she will say, for sure, I'm intervening. This is a total bad. There is no way seeing this as a positive thing. The postmodernism offered us a way to think from the other side of the barricade and look at the situation from their foot and actually say, but if I think I'm right, they think for the same strength and assurance that they are right also. So natural morality that the Rakovsky is talking about in his time, 100 years ago, is not the same in our generation anymore. I totally agree with you, David, that natural morality in a world where everything is subjective, and this, again, deserves a different discussion at all. I agree with you that this natural morality is something that we need to determine whether it's objective, it's objective. I don't have an answer for that now. But if we try and step into Rav Kook's shoes 100 of years ago, it is very clear what is good, what is bad. It's very clear what is right, what is wrong. It's very clear what you should do and what you should not do. And this is what we call common sense in that sense. I hope that was clear enough. If not, let's try and arrange our mini series about Jewish philosophy.
The second part of David's question I thought was really interesting. Torah seems very clear.
To what side?
These are your sources.
To what side? To what side?
That the land of Israel is for the Jewish people, and that's it.
Right, but we also have our obligation to be moral, to be kind to other people.
Okay, but
and how did it get along? I mean, the Torah is very clear to both sides. I don't think the Torah is clear to one side of both. We went out of Egypt in order to get into Israel, to have it at our land, but we also went out of Egypt so we can know because you were strangers in a foreign land and you know how to be kind to other people. We have those both values. We need to try and balance.
I disagree with that statement at the beginning that we weren't formed in Israel. We were, and we're all going to say it in 2.5 weeks when we say Dayanim. And it says, we went out of Egypt. That's right. Okay, we were in Egypt for 210 years. We went out of Egypt, but then we went in the desert. We had the Torah, we had the manna, and that whole sequence of events, which is one continuum. The climax is in Israel with the Beit HaMikdash to atone for our sins. So it was all about being Jews in the land of Israel, and as you know, the end is nested in the beginning. The whole beginning, the whole thing, that whole continuum from the Abraham right on through to the Beit HaMikdash is all about Israel and the Jews.
Okay, we might respectfully disagree on that one, but to be continued on this one. We have time for more questions, Rabbi? I'm here for.
Why don't we take a question from Zoom? If there's something on Zoom. If not, I have just one question that I thought would come up that didn't come up yet. Because a few years ago, Israel was having the same debate about Eritrean refugees. And I was surprised that you didn't bring up the history of Israel's struggles with refugees from other countries. So how is this different or the same as prior debates in Israeli society, which I know are very, very fierce? Like it's shocking to me how fierce Israeli debates can be on these issues that I think directly relate back to Jewish moral principles about the way we see oppressed peoples. Is this the same? Is this just a continuation of the same
No,
arguments?
I-
or is this
I will-
something new?
I will repeat. Maybe the people do hear the question. I will repeat it anyway.
Yeah.
What about the
Eritrean.
Eritrean? Thank you. The Eritrean refugees that came from Eritrea several years ago. Excuse me. Oh,
It's basically the black people.
okay. Whatever we want to call it. There is one problem with this kind of question and with this kind of addressing, and this is they were not refugees. We need to understand the difference. They came to Israel as people who looked for work. As we say in Hebrew, plitei avodah. This is work refugees. Most of them didn't went out of Eritrea, right? In English, is that correct?
Yeah,
Eritrea.
what you're saying is they were seen as, I'm not sure it's always true.
That Israel changed that's how they
Israel
came.
saw them
They changed as
as
refugees.
economic migrants.
That's the term that I'm looking for.
Yes.
Israel saw them as economic migrants. Their status was later changed to refugees. There's a status in Israeli law about what is refugee and how it can, because of this amendment of the Geneva Convention, they were later on changed to refugees. But first of all, they came in order to look for work opportunities in Israel. They snuggle into Israel. They didn't come by Ben Gurion Airport. They didn't come like the Ukrainian refugees who are coming with their passports through. They just crossed from Egypt illegal. They cut the fence with Egypt in Sinai. Not everywhere we have a fence. Today we have already a fence because what happened with them. We didn't usually had a fence. They crossed illegals. They came. My training base when I started the army was 15 minutes drive from what is called Mitkan Cholot. Mitkan Cholot is a place, as we say, a facility where the government built this. It's a facility where they built for all the refugees that came from Africa to put them there in the meantime until we can figure out if they can stay or not. And we were threatened every day. I had to stand on the gate, on the entrance to the base, because there were many African refugees from there that came and tried to steal weapons from my base, and I had to look for that. That not happen. That happened many times because we're 15 minutes from there. It's a totally different discussion. They didn't came legally, they came illegally, they came from the border. We had many problems also because the Negev is packed with military bases. There were problems with us. We brought in as many as possible that we could. They live, most of them today, in southern Tel Aviv, and that's a very complicated situation today in Tel Aviv. Israelis don't want to live there anymore. That's a very difficult problem. The crime rates are very high. They steal from apartment. They take. It's very complicated. There's more than 25,000 of them now in Israel. They didn't go anywhere, of course, and they're taking also jobs from Israel. And we don't have many job opportunities, and that's a different discussion about how Israel should address them. I don't think the government doesn't look at that as well as similar to the Ukrainian refugees in that sense.
Would this also be the same as the Ethiopian? The Ethiopian were Jewish. They're black, they're Jewish, they're
So no, not at all. Not at all. That the Ethiopian were Jews who came by Chok HaShvut, came by the Aliyah by Chok HaShvut. This is a different situation.
No controversy in Israel when it comes to rescuing Jews. The controversy comes with, what about Jews who are, non-Jews who have a friend?
Right, for now. But even though, right.
Oh, they had social problems. Yes.
Yeah, they had social problems.
Of any movement in Israel that said we should not let them in.
Unfortunately,
Let them in and mistreat them, yes, but
unfortunately there was because of based on religious reasons.
real Jews, right?
Based on halacha. I have also a class about this if you want to come. I have another class about this also.
Can we take one question from Zoom or?
The only question was for the number of refugees that you have listed here, is that including Jews as well, or is it just not known, just the total number of people?
The 4,000 new Olim, we don't know if they're Jews. We know that they qualify for Israeli citizenship.
Exactly.
As you're discussing this, Rabbi, I thought we are also soon, the Jewish community in Toronto, going to be faced with a lot of these questions. you're right. Ukrainian refugees are now starting to come to Canada, and we just met with Jais about what to do. We don't know whether there are any Jews who are coming, because it's not a question that Canada asks, are you Jewish? So Jais doesn't know how to identify who's Jewish. We were talking about them holding up a sign in the airport, but of course, that's not a great way of
Any
seeing
Jew come
who's
over?
Jewish and who's not. And then the question becomes, do we have an obligation? Does Jais, which is called the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, do we have a primary obligation towards Jews who are fleeing? And how do we determine whether they're Jews?
Wow.
And or do we have, should we not take into account whether the background of it? I'm just saying it's a question.
Wow.
And you've helped us
I
think
hope so.
already about these issues.
I hope so.
I don't know about all of you, but I did not know. A lot of what was presented today was very new to me. I think we were all focused on what was going on the actual ground in the Ukraine, and weren't really focused on what was going on in Israel with regards to the debates about receiving refugees. So I found this really enlightening.
Thank you.
And opening up very, very deep and questions that are never meant to be answered, but just meant to be wrestled with and thought deeply about. And I hope everyone felt as challenged as I felt throughout your presentation.
Thank you very much.
And I hope you will come back, because
Bezrat Hashem.
you're a very gifted teacher. And thank you everybody for making the effort to be here
Thank you.
tonight, and grab some food on the way out.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.